Hello, everyone. My name is Teresa Sweeney, and on behalf of the National Milk Producers Federation and the National YC program, we are happy to welcome you to our third virtual event titled Dairy on the Hill, Policy Updates and Outlook. A couple of quick notes before we get started. For those of you who have participated in one or two of our webinars before, you'll notice we've organized this one as a Zoom meeting instead of a webinar, so you're able to see each other and interact in the chat box. Please be mindful of your video and your audio and keep yourself muted while the presenters are speaking. We will pause for questions after each section, and we have allocated 10 minutes for a Q&A at the end of the presentation. Secondly, we received a few questions regarding our annual meeting, and we don't yet have an update to share. I will send a note to our YC advisors and our YC Advisory Council once a decision has been made, and set up a time for the Advisory Council to meet virtually to discuss programming. Lastly, this webinar is being recorded. Alrighty, time to get started. This presentation builds on last month's National Milk Producers Federation 101 webinar and is intended to provide you with an update and outlook on our issues. Claudia Larson will be presenting for the Government Relations team. Tony Rice will be sharing the latest trade policy updates, and Michaela Hanselman will be providing an update from the regulatory team. You are welcome to ask questions via the chat box when we pause to switch speakers and/or during the Q&A session. So okay. Our first speaker today is Claudia Larson, who serves as the Director of Government Relations for our organization. Claudia undertakes various advocacy and outreach efforts on a multitude of issues, including immigration, nutrition, and food labeling. Prior to joining NMPF, Claudia served as the Director of Communications and Strategic Policy Associate for the Office of U.S. Representative Jim Costa. Take it away, Claudia.
Great. Thank you, Teresa, for that introduction. Thank you, everyone, for being here today. Teresa, you can go back to the last slide real quick. So just as a quick overview, these are some of the legislative issues that we on the government relations team work on, lobbying on your behalf. Obviously, as different issues pop up, they would be added to this list. This is not an exhaustive list, but this is some areas where we've been very active in recent years. So without reading through all of them, just to give you an overview of what we've done in the past, and we're doing this, go ahead and do the next slide, Teresa, because what we'll be doing today are these three areas regarding setting the stage. So we're going to be talking a little bit about what we've done very, very recently and where this sets us up to move forward. So again, that longer list was just sort of an overview of what we're doing. Today, we're going to focus really on where we are now, and the outlook of where we expect to be by the end of 2020. Or I would say hope to be. You can't really predict what Congress is going to do on any given day. So sort of setting the stage here for what we've seen recently. Basically, since the coronavirus pandemic hit, Congress has really been focusing on COVID-19 relief efforts. They've passed 3 very large and broad relief effort packages. There have been other smaller supplemental bills to, continue funding for programs that have been set, to do some clarification, to extend deadlines and things like that. But for the most part, there have been 3 very, very broad packages. Specific to dairy, they've led to a couple of programs here. I'm just going to run through real quick at the beginning of the presentation that I think are some of the programs that we in the dairy industry are recognizing as rising from these broad COVID-19 relief packages. But again, these are huge packages that have impacted sectors across our economy and Americans across the country. So most specifically to dairy, these large COVID-19 relief packages, we've seen our CFAP program, the USDA's Coronavirus Food Assistance Program, have come out of these broad COVID-19 packages. We've also seen USDA's Farmers to Families Food Box program. We've seen in the COVID-19 relief efforts additional funding and flexibility for a lot of our nutrition programs. And then we've also seen the development of the Small Business Administration's Paycheck Protection Program, and then the COVID-19 specific EIDLs, or Economic Injury Disaster Loans. Currently, federal government is balancing this ongoing response to the COVID-19 pandemic, because we're still working through it, as all of you know, every day. But then they're also starting to pick up some of the other responsibilities that they have as our federal government. So currently, we see them working on a fourth large COVID-19 relief package. They're also starting to move on appropriations bills. The Congress is responsible for funding our government and funding all of these programs, and to do so, they have to pass these appropriations bills regardless of whether or not we're in a pandemic. And then we're also seeing additional small business support measures being worked on right now. And the last thing we're going to discuss during my presentation is, the politics of all of this. And let's not forget that the election is quickly approaching. It's going to affect an area that I've been really active working on, this ag labor bill that we worked on last year. I'll do a brief review of that, as well as what to expect in the future. And then also looking at the election and what it's going to do to the policy landscape moving forward post-election. So next slide, please. Thank you. So again, thus far, we've seen, coming out of the COVID-19 3 broad relief packages, the USDA's Coronavirus Food Assistance Program. These are the direct assistance payments for our food producers. These are the ones that hopefully, if you've decided to take these payments, you're working with your local FSA office to file for these payments. These are just some of the specifics of it. If you guys have any questions about this program at any point in time, don't hesitate to reach out to us and we'll fill you in. Deadline for filing for these payments is August though, so if you haven't filed yet and you want to file, we encourage you to reach out to your local FSA office and get started on that process. Also seeing USDA's the Farmers to Family Food Box Program. This is the government purchasing up to $3 billion total in the dairy, meat, and fresh produce. These commodities the government purchases, and then they're packaged in what we would call family-sized boxes, why we call it the Families Food Box Program, and then distributed to different local organizations to distribute to those facing food insecurity. So we think about our food banks, community organizations, faith-based organizations, things like that. So again, the government is paying to purchase food directly from our producers. It's packaged up and then it's provided to these community-based food distribution packages. We've seen coming out of this, the Farmers to Families Food Box Program, the first round, dairy got $320 million for purchases and distribution. We worked really hard at National Milk to see that. That's an increase over what we were expecting, so we were pleased to see that. Second round of funding, again, sorry, excuse me, I apologize, something just popped up on my screen. Second round of funding goes through August 31st, and then there should be a third round of funding that will take effect coming in September. The last thing that we've seen coming out of these programs coming out of these relief packages are additional funding and flexibilities for our nutrition programs. So SNAP, emergency food assistance programs, WIC, elderly feeding programs, things like that. We've seen in these coronavirus packages additional funding and then also flexibilities for these programs. A lot of these nutrition programs have some pretty strict requirements regarding how the food is spent, those who are eligible to take advantage of the nutrition programs, the different requirements about them going to the doctor, different means testings requirements and things like that. We've just seen a lot of flexibility granted to these programs through the COVID-19 relief effort more broadly. Next slide, please. Great. Also coming out of the COVID-19 relief efforts through SBA, the Small Business Administration, we've seen 2 small business support programs come out of the COVID-19 relief programs. The first is the Paycheck Protection Program, or PPP. Really briefly, this is a loan guarantee program to help small businesses keep their workers employed. So there's a large emphasis on payroll. Your loans are based on payroll. You have to spend a lot of those loan funds on payroll. Again, really focusing, hence the title, Paycheck Protection Program, really focusing on keeping workers employed. The second COVID-19 specific program offered through SBA is the COVID-19 Economic injury disaster loan. These are, I call them EIDLs, other people pronounce it IDLs. This is a direct loan program. There's more flexibility on it. It's providing small businesses working capital. So there's more flexibility on how that money is spent. And you can also get an advanced grant through the EIDL program. So in general, just to give you guys a real quick background here, agriculture more broadly often does not qualify for SBA programs. So when these programs were were created specific to COVID-19, there were a fair amount of obstacles that agriculture was facing in accessing the program, just because these were new programs, these were passed very, very quickly. And again, agriculture doesn't typically have a pre-existing relationship with the Small Business Administration or with SBA. So we worked really hard to overcome a lot of these obstacles. We're still working in this space, which I'll speak to in a second, but just as a quick review, we finally secured some language to make sure that agriculture and dairy could access the EIDL loans, the economic injury disaster loans. And in fact, when the second round of funding went through, agriculture was the first group that was even allowed to apply for these new loans. And for a while, they were the only ag group that were allowed to apply for these loans. And we worked really hard to secure that. Second, some progress we've made on PPP. We secured the broadest eligibility for agriculture possible, regardless of how much money the business made. This has been the general obstacle that ag has faced in working with SBA in the past, that income-based limitation, and we worked really hard to make sure that did not apply for the PPP program. And then also, Congress provided a set-aside of $60 billion for the smaller lenders, including community banks and credit unions, the banks that most typically have a pre-existing relationship with agriculture and others in rural communities. We had seen with PPP that the money just wasn't getting to our farmers. And a lot of that had to do with the fact that most of the lenders who had pre-existing relationships with SBA were in urban areas or were larger lenders. So we worked hard to make sure that our banks that lent to our farmers were getting access to that money so that our farmers could then in fact apply for the loans. Next, please. Teresa, did you want to?
Sure. So we're going to do a quick poll from our participants. So if you guys are producers, if you could answer, which coronavirus relief measures have you taken advantage of? The options are CFAP, PPP, EIDL, other, or none. Good. 2 more seconds. Okay. These are the results. You guys need to apply for CFAP.
Okay, great. So looking forward with the COVID relief efforts that are continuing right now, within SBA, there's currently still 120 billion plus dollars remaining in PPP funds for loans. We at National Milk are continuing to work on bipartisan legislation to address one of the major obstacles that still remains with our smaller farmers, with our sole proprietor farmers. We're working really hard to address a remaining issue that has been making it difficult for them to access the program. We're unsure with if future SBA relief efforts within the COVID space will be a standalone bill or if they'll be part of another one of these large packages that are coming out of Congress. There's discussion right now about a standalone bill, but again, you never really can predict what Congress is going to do. So we are going to continue to be active in this space and do everything we can to make sure that farmers are getting equitable access to these programs, whether it be in a standalone SBA bill or in a larger, the next round, the next, fourth COVID-19 specific relief package. With US, can we go? Yep, thanks. With USDA, there's still $50 million remaining in the Farmers to Family Food Box program. That's already been allocated, or excuse me, that's been appropriated, so it's sitting there and we're expecting that to be used in September. There's potential for additional funding of direct payments, whether it be through a CFAP program or through a new program that USDA creates. But in the next broader relief package, there is the potential for additional funding for direct payments. And there's also potential for additional funding and flexibilities for nutrition programs in the next relief package as well. So this next relief package that I keep on talking about, this fourth broad coronavirus relief package, the House passed its version of that called the HEROES Act. They passed it in May. That version has some helpful dairy provisions, including additional direct payment and nutrition program support. It creates a direct dairy donation program to help encourage and incentivize the direct donation of fluid milk to programs that could give it to our food insecure. There's also a loan recourse program in that HEROES Act to help assist dairy processors. HEROES Act also includes some DMC enhancements to address production history issues, just some ongoing issues we've had with DMC. The House chose to include that in its COVID-19 fourth relief package, the HEROES Act. The Senate is currently working on its fourth relief package. No word on when that's going to come out, but we know people are talking about it, and we are on the Hill. We are speaking with people on the Hill. It's COVID-19 as frequently as we can to make sure that dairy is a part of that conversation. The final package will need to resolve several agricultural issues. You know, how much funding will it provide to USDA? Are there any guardrails on how that funding will be spent? Will there be some issues that we've had with payment limitations on the direct spending? Are they going to address that in statute in this next relief package, or are they going to look to USDA to make changes? And then also, should we expand nutrition assistance as well? These are the outstanding issues that are being discussed right now in the COVID-19 relief package, or in the discussion of the next COVID-19 relief package. Thanks, Teresa. Great. So like I said, Congress also has to continue to work outside of the COVID-19 space on responsibilities that it has, and one of them is to fund our government. So they've been working on the 2021 appropriations bills. The House is working on them. It looks like they'll be voting on those bills on the House floor sometime starting next week by the end of July. Looking at the House Agriculture and FDA appropriations bill specifically, there are some areas that we in National Milk have been having conversations on the Hill about these issue areas, and again, we're tracking them to see how they change or progress as the appropriations bills continue through the legislative process rather. There's language in these bills that protects 1% flavored milk in the school meal programs, while USDA addresses a recent court decision without going in all of the aspects of that. Just know that we are working to make sure that kids can continue to have access to 1% flavored milk in the school meal program moving forward. There's also language urging FDA to continue to work towards ultimately enforcing standards of identity for dairy products. I know how I feel about this. Dairy means dairy, and we want FDA to enforce the standards that it has about that. There's additional language and dollars in the appropriations bill for the Farm and Ranch Stress Assistance Network. There's $9 million for USDA's $990 million for USDA's Reconnect program, which is a broadband expansion program run through USDA. There's $1 million for the Dairy Business Innovation Initiative, and there's $1 million for the Healthy Fluid Milk Incentives Project, both of which were created in the 2018 Farm Bill. Currently, it's a little bit unclear as to when the Senate will take up and pass its 2021 appropriations bills. House always moves first, and we will continue to track this as they move through the House, and then also as hopefully the Senate will start discussing its appropriations bills soon, hopefully. Next slide, please. So one topic that's always, we're all always very passionate about in the dairy industry is ag labor reform, recognizing the just dearth of access we have to the labor that we need to continue to produce milk every day. We had some progress in this space last year in 2019 with the House passing the Bipartisan Farm Workforce Modernization Act in December. This was a bill that was led by Congresswoman Zoe Lofgren, a Democrat from California, and Congressman Dan Newhouse, a Republican from Washington, with an additional 43 co-sponsors on the bill. It was a solidly and respectably bipartisan immigration reform bill. We are really proud of this and the work that we put into crafting a bipartisan bill that could pass through the House of Representatives and be taken seriously by the Senate. The bill itself provides legal status for current workers and their families, and then also allows dairy to access the H-2A program. As all of you know, dairy cannot access the H-2A program right now. We've been working very hard to do everything we can to make sure that our dairy farmers have access to a reliable source of additional labor. When this passed the House in December, we shifted our focus to working on the Senate, recognizing the bill passed in the House, a respectable amount of bipartisan support. There were conversations in the Senate about taking up the issue of ag labor reform. Senators Thom Tillis, who's Republican from North Carolina, and Dianne Feinstein, Democrat from California, wanted to address the labor needs of agriculture. We were working in the Senate to continue to build support for a bipartisan effort here. And actually in March, we hosted a fly-in bringing 54 dairy farmers to the Senate to meet with senators and their staff to talk about how important ag labor reform was, and to add to this momentum of the bill passing in the House, and asking their senators to get involved and actually solve the problem that all of us are facing in agriculture. That our last day of the fly-in was a Thursday, and the Senate shut down on Monday for COVID-19. So needless to say, some of the wind was taken out of our sails, but we are continuing to have discussions with Senate offices on this space, or the Senate offices in this space. Hopefully conversations will resume shortly, but as of right now, there is a lot of focus on COVID-19 and not a lot of focus on immigration reform. Next slide, we'll discuss a little bit more about why that is. Oh, perfect, thank you. So looking forward with ag labor reform, the Supreme Court recently overturned President Trump's rescission of DACA based on an executive procedure problem. So there's no immediate need for a DACA fix bill. We bring this up with the idea being if the Supreme Court had upheld President Trump's rescission of DACA, we were pretty confident that there was going to be a big push in Congress to address the Dreamers who were here under the DACA program and to come up with some sort of a DACA fix. And there was discussion that potentially ag labor reform could be attached to a DACA fix bill. And so the DACA fix bill would sort of be our vehicle for moving forward. But with the Supreme Court overturning President Trump's rescission of the DACA program, there's no need for a DACA fix bill. And so that vehicle has sort of pittered away, and we don't expect to see that coming anytime soon. We are continuing to seek action by the Trump administration in the immigration reform space, in this ag labor reform space, having the conversations with the Trump administration and working really hard to see that enforcement issues are being addressed, and having discussions with them about making administrative changes to H-2A as opposed to a congressional change to H-2A, hoping that maybe an administrative change would allow dairy to access H-2A, still working in that space, but again, don't expect to see any change this year, because basically the appetite for immigration reform is really waning right now in both the White House and on the Hill. People are still navigating through the COVID-19 pandemic, and the election draws near every day. And immigration reform is a hotly contested and a highly controversial issue. And elected officials tend to steer clear of such lightning rod issues the closer we get to elections. We at National Milk are continuing our efforts in this space, though. We're discussing ag labor reform with our champions on the Hill. We're working to continue these conversations to develop and strengthen our relationships with our allies, to having discussions about improving the House's Farm Workforce Modernization Act, and then also really being prepared and standing ready so that if a window of opportunity opens for us to move an ag labor bill, we're there, we're ready to move it, and we can seize that window of opportunity and hopefully move something forward if one were to open. Next slide, please. So speaking of elections and looking into the future, the election effects on future policy, I'm not going to claim that I can predict who can win an election, but we do have some ideas of what would happen if different candidates won. If Trump were to win, we expect the status quo in many respects to continue. Ag labor has been is an issue that's proven difficult to solve in this divided government. His administration has demonstrated preferences within the trade space for bilateral agreements, and we would expect that to continue. And it's also unclear if cooperation between the Trump administration and the Congress would increase, given some of the tensions that rise during campaign season. Campaigns are tough and people say difficult things, and sometimes it takes a little while for those sorts of things to settle. Now, if Biden wins, some issues may become easier to address. Ag labor may be easier to address. No promises with immigration reform ever, but it may be easier to address and to get some ag labor resolution in that space, because we would have potentially some moderate Democrats and Republicans continuing to work together under President Biden, who may be more likely to sign an immigration reform bill focusing on ag labor. There is the potential for climate legislation to pick up under President Biden if he were to be elected. And there's questions about whether there would be increased bipartisanship. Again, only the future will tell us that. But regardless of who wins, National Milk's going to continue to work with our stakeholders to build relationships with the new players who come in, regardless of the outcome of the election. And we're going to continue to advocate for dairy farmers on a wide range of issues.
Thank you, Claudia. At this time, we're going to pause for a minute or two for questions. Please use the chat box or unmute yourself to ask a question. Please note that we will also have a Q&A at the end of the entire presentation, if you'd like to hold it till then. We'll just pause for a little bit. Okay, we'll keep going. Next up is Tony Rice. Tony works jointly with NMPF and the U.S. Dairy Export Council as the manager of trade policy. He works with our organization's trade policy team to advance the development and implementation of NMPF's work to support policies that promote U.S. dairy exports and to address foreign barriers to U.S. dairy sales. Tony, take it away.
Well, thank you, Teresa, and thank you to everyone who can join today. It's good to have everyone together for this little bit of a briefing in this condensed hour. To give you a little bit of background, I work on trade policy, as Teresa said, with Jaime Castaneda and Shauna Morris, and we have a dual role with both the National Milk Producers and the U.S. Dairy Export Council, once again advocating for, as Claudia was talking about, domestic policy. We're looking outside our borders. Right now, we export about 15% of total production in the United States, and we're looking to grow that in the future. I see Teresa has pulled up a poll here. If you want to take a moment to answer, the question is, which international market are you most interested in learning about? Of course, China, Canada, and Mexico are our top three, but the other four there, we have ongoing interest, either with ongoing bilateral negotiations or just recent history in conclusion of negotiations. So I'll give you a moment to respond. Well, it's fairly balanced. Okay. So I'm going to touch base on all four of those there, as well as the UK and the EU a little bit too. But yeah, as I was mentioning, the trade policy team, we touch on, of course, trade issues, naturally, but also looking at any impediments that may occur to our exports going into whatever it may be, a market in Canada, Mexico, India, not necessarily on trade policy front, but also market access, ensuring that U.S. dairy products receive the full benefit of trade deals. So while we work on trade policy, actually getting policies across the line, we're also looking at making sure those policies are enforced and our members are able to take full benefit of them. And we'll touch base on that, especially with the new one. USMCA replaced NAFTA. It went into effect July 1. This has been a long touted achievement for the US government, for the Trump administration, as the re-up of NAFTA over the past few years. And as one of the major winners, dairy has been touted as one of the major winners in the agreement, with estimates of about $300 million a year extra trade going into Canada in particular, and also some additional protections in Mexico. But the real key here is making sure that those gains are fully realized through enforcement. So while on paper, USMCA secures a lot of wins for dairy, we're really concerned about making sure that those wins are held in force. In particular with Canada. As many of you are familiar with, Canada has long had, let's say, a troublesome history with the United States, particularly in regards to their supply management scheme, which has caused a lot of issues for us. They have long sought to disincentivize imports, even though Canada is our second largest market, second or third largest, depending on the year. But we're looking to make sure that in the USMCA, these problems are rectified and that issues as far as disincentivizing our imports are fixed. And the main key here for the immediate term is the tariff rate quotas. We're very concerned that the Canadians have announced that the TRQs are going to be provided to producers who do not have the impetus to import product. Instead of giving the TRQ to a retailer who may want to import, higher quality U.S. cheeses, they're providing them to Canadian producers who essentially are our competitors, as they're coming from a cooperative or the producer community. So we're looking to pressure the Canadians into shifting this method of allocating their TRQs to make it more fair and more in line with the terms of the USMCA. And that's an ongoing battle. That's a lot of what trade policy does, is a constant communication with US government to ensure that these types of deals are enforced. Looking ahead, 6 months from now, Canada has to replace their Class 7 pricing scheme, which is the program, much as we have our class pricing program in the United States, was created in 2017 for skim milk components to lower domestic prices for domestic producers. And it's caused us problems for many years. It's a very complicated issue, and they finally come around to addressing it. Our concern here is, number one, transparency into what it's going to look like after that Class 7 is dissolved. We have ideas that the Canadians are likely going to try to play games and replace that Class 7 with some new pricing structure. But for now, the time being, we're not sure what that's going to look like. But we're going to continue to work with the U.S. Trade Representative's office to make sure that Canada abides by what they agreed to effectively in the USMCA. Moving to our neighbors to the south, Mexico, which is our largest dairy market. We don't have near as many issues as far as trade goes. It's been a very good market for us for many years, but there are some small issues that we're concerned about, particularly around standards. One in particular is a cheese conformity assessment that Mexico has recently been pushing back and forth within their Ministry of Health internally on making requirements for cheese conformity, so the standards for what constitute as a particular type of cheese is treated differently as an import versus domestic producers. So this is goes against the tenets of what fair international trade rules are. And once again, we're pressuring our government to make sure that it's a clear message to Mexico that this is not something that we will accept, effectively favoring domestic producers at the expense of a long-standing trading relationships with U.S. producers. So that's a key there, as well as other smaller concerns that pop up, whether it be certification or facility registration concerns in Mexico. And then one of our issues I'll touch on a little further later on, common names. This has been one of our key topics in USMCA, as the agreement had a list of common cheese names such as Gorgonzola, Parmesan, Asiago, ones that we claim and for many years US producers have used as a generic term. The European Union is trying to effectively create a monopoly on those terms and place geographical indication restrictions on the use of those terms, saying that, for example, Parmesan can only originate from Italy. So while we were negotiating the USMCA agreement, the EU was also negotiating a bilateral agreement with Mexico and trying to enhance those GI restrictions. But we were fortunate enough to get a list, a side letter of names included in this agreement. There are some concerns with that the Mexicans are not honoring that side letter. But once again, this all goes back to our role here, making sure that the US government is aware of these issues, and even more than that, doing something about it. So USMCA, there are gains for dairy, but we're looking to make sure that those gains come to fruition. Our other big key trade deal that occurred early in January here was China, a limited China phase 1, if you will, trade deal. It's been, for the most part, fairly beneficial for dairy, as a lot of the regulatory concerns that we had been addressed, such as a key one is facility registration, making logistics of getting dairy products from the United States into China a lot easier. But there are still outstanding concerns, namely around the tariffs issue. Now, tariffs have been cut. Well, first they were escalated through the tariff war that was ongoing, but they have been cut since then, as well as some tariff exemptions for some dairy products have been granted on top of those cuts. But we're still seeing that China is struggling to purchase the products that they agreed to in the phase 1 agreement. That covers all of agriculture, of course, but dairy is a part of that. And even with it seems that they're making a concerted effort to purchase more products, but with the concerns of coronavirus, as well as just other economic concerns in China right now, it's becoming looking more and more like they're not going to meet those targets. Adding on top of that, and kind of conflating the problem even further, is the issue with COVID-19 and the blame that the Trump administration is placing, and the pressure that the administration is placing on China over responsibility for this epidemic or pandemic. So this is all kind of coming to a boil at this point. And earlier today, President Trump just signed an executive order revoking the recognition of Hong Kong as a special trading status. For many years, the United States and China both recognized Hong Kong as one country, two systems. And as China has kind of cracked down on some political dissenters in Hong Kong, it's become a pretty fraught situation. And now that there are more sanctions and there's uncertainty about what this executive order will mean for the future of trading with China, as Hong Kong has long been a gateway for dairy products getting into China, it's looking more and more tenuous that a trade deal is not going to stay intact. But here's for hoping. So we'll see what will come in the next few months, whether or not the United States will declare the trade deal moot. But for the time being, China is making some important strides, particularly, once again, on regulatory issues, as well as the purchases front. So that's China. Moving ahead to some other, I wouldn't say smaller, as in any normal year, these would be headline issues, but China and USMCA happening in the same year kind of took a lot of the air out of the room. But other things we're working on are an ongoing negotiation with the United Kingdom. The United Kingdom is, I believe, I might be mistaken, but I believe the largest importer of cheese per capita in the world. And not a whole lot of that comes from the United States. Most of it comes from the European Union. But we're looking to make some gains there as the United Kingdom breaks away from the European Union. They're officially no longer part of the European Union. but right now they're in this transitional period where they're ironing out new trade agreements, new custom agreements, whatever the agreements with the common agricultural policy will be in terms of the European Union, while simultaneously negotiating with us and other countries on standalone trade agreements with the UK. And as a dairy industry, we're looking for, of course, some more favorable terms on the regulatory front, but the main point is coming back to the common names. Because the UK imports so much cheese, we want to make sure that we have the right to import Gorgonzola, Parmesan, Asiago, export to that market in the future. We've been pressuring the US Trade Representative a lot on this issue, and we're hoping that we can see something similar to what we've seen in USMCA on a side letter of a list of names to be protected. But those negotiations are ongoing. Another market is Kenya. We don't trade hardly anything with Kenya right now, but negotiations have begun between the US and Kenya, and basis of this is we're just looking to make a precedent in sub-Saharan Africa on the items listed here. Once again, common names, regulatory issues, and international forums. The last one there, international forums, is we're looking to build up partnerships around the world. We have historically in Latin America have a lot of partners on dairy, international dairy concerns. For example, Codex and the WHO, the World Health Organization, the World Health Assembly. We've tried to pressure those organizations through proxies, such as Latin America, now looking to Kenya to make sure that we have standards, international standards that are fair to dairy and don't impose critical elements of typically European basis on dairy industry around the world. So once again, not a huge market, but looking to at least get in writing some precedents set. Other things I'll just breeze through quickly here. Japan, our organization had a letter, got, I believe, 51 signatures in the House that we circulated. Some of you may have been involved in that outreach effort to legislators. The basis of it is that this is a very important market for the United States. It's our 5th largest market and dairy market, and we're making sure that we can get the full gains of a deal with Japan. Other ones, Brazil. Right now, that's kind of faded out a little bit. It looks like USTR wants to have some negotiations on their non-tariff issues, and we're looking at maybe GIs, the common names concern, as one of them. India, I'll touch on that a little later, and then China phase 2. At this point, probably not going to happen this year, might not even happen at all at this point. We'll see if China phase 1 stays intact for now. And then a few other things, coming back to the common names issue. This is something that my supervisors have started, the Consortium for Common Food Names, a couple years ago as a means of protecting these generic terms around the world, making sure that the European Union doesn't go about their nefarious ways and try to monopolize every term out there that you can imagine for cheeses. And of course, we work with other partners in the wine industry and the meat industry as well, but primarily cheeses. Our largest project right now is working with the US Trade Representative's Office to set a precedent like we've seen in USMCA, but going beyond that, in that every negotiation that the US government undertakes, we want them to explicitly lay out in no uncertain terms that generic terms are not to be infringed upon, and moreover than that, have a non-exhaustive list of names to be protected in perpetuity for common use, not just for the US, but for any trading partner. So what we've been doing to pressure USTR is circulating a letter in the Senate. We're currently up to 49 signatures, so almost 50% of the Senate we've gotten to sign on. If you're interested, we could really use your help in reaching out to the remaining 51 senators to try to get, well, probably going to get a majority on this, but hopefully a supermajority to really send a message to USTR that this is a very pressing concern. It has a lot of economic impacts, not just now, but down the line, unless we do something. So this is something that we've been working on for a few weeks now, and we're looking to conclude the Senate side of this the end of this month, July 29th, and then move over to the House to have a companion letter as well. And then some other smaller projects. Trade policy, like I said, works on a lot of market access issues. One of those being concerns that the EU was looking to dump skim milk powder. Well, they stockpile it. It's called their intervention program, and then offload it, effectively dumping it in other markets around the world. And it's been something that we've been concerned about in 2016, 2017, 2018. They did this, and now with the COVID-19 pandemic, it looks like they're going to go about their old ways again and try to stockpile more product and offload it at a later date. But we led an effort with our Latin partners and had a letter sent, as well as speaking with the US government about this issue, making sure that the EU doesn't unfairly undercut our competitiveness in third-party markets. And then coming back to India, India causes us all sorts of problems as well. It looks like it was going to be a mini trade agreement. That didn't happen. Then it was going to be a comprehensive agreement with India, and that's probably not going to happen. But we always have ongoing issues. One of them is that they just changed some certification requirements for product coming into India, particularly for lactose, where we had ships on the water that were detained and held at the ports because they didn't have the certification requirements, even though they announced them while they were midway across the world. So we were working with a regulatory staff at the U.S. Dairy Export Council to get those shipments released, as well as making sure our members, national milk members who do export, have ongoing access to that market. So that's a lot of stuff in a short amount of time, but hopefully you got something out of it. And if you have any questions, you can either ask now or probably at the end too.
Thanks, Tony. We'll pause for a second. If anyone has any questions, I'd encourage you to unmute yourself or to type it into the chat box. Let's see. Okay, for the sake of time, we're gonna keep going. Our final presenter this evening is Michaela Hanselman. Michaela is our organization's manager of regulatory affairs. She works on NMPF's regulatory efforts, focusing on issues related to interstate shipments of milk, food safety, labeling, nutrition, and the environment.
Thank you, Teresa, and good evening, everyone. As Teresa said, I'm on the regulatory team with Clay Detlefson and Jamie Jonker, which I think we would all argue is the best team at NMPF. Together, we focus on a broad array of issues, from labeling enforcement to environmental issues to antibiotics to the National Conference on Interstate Milk Shipments. I'm working on a new thing every day, which is honestly one of my favorite parts of my job, aside from being able to represent dairy farmers, of course. Next slide, please. So before I provide some examples of the current projects we work on, I wanted to generally go over what we do, because we often get confused with government relations and the policy side of things. The regulatory team largely works with the agencies, so USDA, FDA, and EPA, on regulations which are the implementation of the law that was written. We do this through commenting on proposed and final rules and being in constant contact with the agency staff to know what is going to come down the pipeline. So this can be email, meetings, lots of talking to people, and just trying to generally make sure that dairy farmers' needs are being met and not hindered by regulations. Next slide. So now I'm going to dive into some of the topics I'm going to cover tonight. I'm covering a topic that's tied to each agency, so you'll see kind of the diversity of what we do. So the first one is my personal favorite topic. It's the dietary guidelines for Americans. The DGAs are rewritten every 5 years by USDA and the Health and Human Services. They were last published in 2015, and the process for writing the 2020-25 guidelines began early last year. It's a 2-year process that involves the selection of a scientific advisory committee, which reviews the newest science and releases a scientific report with recommendations for the new guidelines. This ensures that the process is unbiased and is fully just focused on the science. However, during the process, there's the option for public comment and written comment. NMPF did both, advocating for 3 servings of dairy products, dairy remaining its own food group, and the recognition of the new science on full-fat dairy. We also recently sent a letter to the committee asking them to include the newer science on full-fat dairy. We will submit another set of comments once the scientific report is out, which is supposed to be out tomorrow, which I'm very excited about. And finally, provide another set of oral comments to USDA and HHS. The guidelines are extremely important for the dairy industry, as the school lunch program is determined from the dietary guidelines. From the meetings so far, we've learned that low-fat and fat-free dairy is still recommended in all the healthy eating patterns, and dairy has also been acknowledged as a complementary foods for 6 to 12 months and 12 to 24 months. Next slide, please. Another hot topic for us has been pushing FDA to enforce the standards of identity. For those that don't know, standards of identity are kind of definitions given to food to decrease consumer confusion, and originally they were put in place to prevent the adulteration of food, and therefore only products that meet this definition are technically supposed to be able to use that word on their labels. However, plant-based companies haven't been following the rules for a very long time, as you can see with the almond milks, which are almond beverages, or the plant butter or vegan cheese that are on the shelf at the grocery store. NMPF has continually pushed FDA to enforce the standards of identity, including filing a citizen petition last year, which provided a roadmap for the proper way for plant-based companies to be labeling their products. There's also currently a docket open that was originally opened in 2005, which is basically a set of general principles that FDA wants to use to update and revise the standards of identity. We're going to comment on that, saying that while we appreciate FDA's effort and we agree with the general principles for the most part, that the standards of identity don't really mean much unless you're enforcing them. Next slide, please. Switching gears a bit, now we'll look at some of our work with the EPA, which is environmental focused. So the Navigable Waters Protection Act, or the New Waters of the US, was finally released earlier this year after a long battle to have the 2015 WOTUS rule repealed. We're actually very happy with the Navigable Waters Protection Act, which defines the scope of waters subject to federal regulation. It pulled back federal oversight and clarified which waters it encompassed. Thankfully, this ended in our favor. However, it doesn't seem like it's going to hold. The Navigable Waters Protection Act, which went into effect June 22nd, is only actually in effect in 49 states right now. It's not in effect in Colorado, which has already issued a preliminary injunction, which is just one of the many lawsuits filed against the rule, leading to uncertainty as to what rule will apply if the courts do issue injunctions. So while we are happy with where we are at the moment, we know that there will most likely be more work in the future. Next slide. This slide touches on most of our work with USDA and then some of the international work we do as well. So first, touching on international stuff, the International Dairy Federation, also known as IDF, is the global trade association for dairy. IDF produces international dairy standards from farm to consumer and advocates dairy positions to OIE, Codex, and others. NMPF regulatory staff serve as US subject matter experts to IDF, just as there are other experts from other countries. So this ensures that our perspectives are included and the perspectives of our competitors are properly balanced. We have been working with the government and International Dairy Federation to represent US dairy interests and Codex food standards related to antimicrobial resistance. Through this advocacy, we have been successful in keeping these food standards grounded in science to prevent the EU and other companies from unduly limiting dairy farmer access to antibiotics important for treating, controlling, and preventing disease in dairy animals. So this also kind of has to do with what Tony was talking about with the trade regulations. And then looking more at what we do here stateside, so NMPF also works with USDA on various animal disease issues, including foreign animal disease preparedness. So a good example of this is foot and mouth disease. So in 2013, NMPF put together a task force to establish priorities to advocate for foot and mouth disease preparedness. And these priorities went on to be approved by the board in 2014. Funding for foot and mouth disease preparedness was then included in the 2018 Farm Bill. And just last week, USDA made an initial purchase of $27.1 million in foot and mouth disease vaccine for the National Animal Vaccine and Veterinary Countermeasures Bank. This was a part of a multi-year commitment to modernize the FMD vaccine bank. NMPF has now taken a similar approach to bovine tuberculosis. USDA is currently updating the bovine tuberculosis rule because the rule doesn't really align with where the country is at as a whole with bovine tuberculosis. So we've created a task force of co-op staff, industry, and dairy farmers and vets to kind of learn about bovine tuberculosis and set priorities for us that we can then advocate for when the new rule comes out, and work with USDA to get to where we want to be. Next slide, please. And then the last slide I'm going to touch on is the Net Zero Initiative. In February, the DMI board endorsed, and in March, the NMPF board and Innovation Center endorsed the 2050 sustainability goals for U.S. dairy to be an environmental solution. These goals are become carbon neutral or better, optimize water use while maximizing recycling, improve water quality by optimizing utilization of manure and nutrients. The Net Zero Initiative is working to remove financial, technical, and other barriers that stand in the way of farms making changes by creating new revenue streams through manure-based product and market development and the creation of environmental services trading markets. NMPF will drive policy, legislation, and incentives that encourage fast adoption by dairy farmers. It's important for us to note, though, that activities proposed to be funded by the dairy checkoff will be subject to the approval of USDA. No checkoff funds will be used for the purpose of influencing governmental action or policy. And while net zero emissions may not be achieved by every farm, the collective efforts of all dairy farms will lead to a net zero greenhouse gas emissions for U.S. dairy farm milk production. NMPF as a whole will help work with regulations and policy to help make this possible for our dairy farmers. And we're very excited about this initiative. And with that, I'll pass it back to Teresa or Chris for questions. Thank you.
Thanks, Michaela. At this time, Senior Vice President of Membership Services and Strategic Initiatives, Chris Galen, will facilitate the Q&A portion of our webinar, including any questions.
In the next 30 seconds, right?
Yes.
And that was the one question we had time for. You've already answered it, so. Thank you, Teresa. Well, we haven't had a lot of questions so far, so you might just want to remind people that they can take themselves off mute, or they can go to the chat box, which is on the ribbon either at the top of your or bottom of your screen, to write out a question, and we'll just wait for a couple minutes and then wrap it up, right? I have a question, Claudia, for you, if you're still on, and that is, obviously a lot of what's going to happen from here on out on Capitol Hill this year is going to be driven by election year politics. We know what we've got in the last 3.5 years from the Trump administration, and you talked a little bit about what would happen if Joe Biden were elected president. Who is he listening to right now as he develops either ag policy or rural policy? Who are some of the voices in Congress or outside of Capitol Hill that will help shape a Biden administration policy if he were to be elected in November?
Chris, thank you for this question. This is a really interesting question. This is something that, quite honestly, Paul would be a little bit stronger at answering than I am, given just how Paul seems to know everything all of the time. So, dear YCs, if you ever have questions, Paul Bleiberg is a great person to ask, as is everyone at National Milk with Paul Bleiberg. Man, does he know his politics. I would say that Mr. Biden created a lot of very strong and lasting relationships when he was in the Senate, some very strong bipartisan relationships, which is part of why our prediction was that if he were to be elected, there may be an increased chance for bipartisanship. So I would expect him to be calling on some of the relationships that he developed back there, but including, well, you stumped me a little bit, Chris, because okay. I don't know what's going on in his head, but
There's no wrong answers here.
Yeah, well, there could be wrong answers here. So I don't want to provide them. So I would say, just as speculatively, I mean, Joe Biden's had a very long career in politics, and one of the things that keeps politics going is our lasting relationships. So I would say I would expect him to be pulling on some of the relationships he developed while he was in the Senate, as well as some of the relationships he developed when he was in the White House as the vice president.
Okay.
But very specific relationships there, I wouldn't be able to answer that without
Okay.
it being me just guessing.
Well, we will see if we need to see. We do have a question here from Chris Scheider asking about exports. Tony, hopefully you've got some data on this. We've had two things happen. One is just a huge slowdown in the global economy, but now we've got just this huge surge in commodity prices. I think cheese was at a record again this week. So what's that been doing to our exports, and who actually is still buying, and what are they buying?
Sure. So yeah, if you're not familiar, the beginning of 2020 was a downward trend for exports, and then it began picking up almost unexpectedly in March and April here in May. And a lot of that is due to the commodity prices. They bottomed out and now they're on the uprise, especially block and barrel cheeses as they're headed up. And a lot of that is due to the fact that a lot of countries in Southeast Asia, China in particular, are ramping up their restaurant use and preparation for reopening. So a lot of the cheeses are being purchased and stockpiled because a lot of it was just laying in storage for a while, and now demand is high. So as far as specific countries that are doing the purchasing, it's pretty widespread. I would say our largest market, Mexico, is actually not one of the ones that is purchasing the most. They're having issues with the Mexican economy. Peso is down, so there's some trouble there. But as I mentioned before, China in particular is making a concerted effort to purchase more, particularly U.S. products, so that they can meet the terms of the China trade deal. But once again, yeah, it's across the board. Southeast Asia is purchasing more. It's just an upward swing. Our economists did a presentation, or the U.S. Dairy Export Council economists did a presentation earlier today, and the prediction is that this is likely a bubble of at least some extent. As we're ramping up these purchases, it's eventually going to go on the downside and eventually level out towards the end of 2020, beginning of 2021, somewhat back to our normal levels we were at 2019 in terms of exports. So hopefully that answered some of your questions. I'm not an economist, but I can, if you have additional questions, I can put you in touch with people who are much well versed than I.
Well, if you have two hands, that means then you're an economist. So sorry, Tony, you have to cop to that. I'm going to toss it back to you, Teresa, with a question, and then you can close this out. If the folks who have stuck with us here for the last hour have more questions about all these issues we've been talking about, where can they go on our website or our social media channels to find out more?
Thanks, Chris. We didn't even script that. You guys can email us with any additional questions at info@nmpf.org. You can also check out our website, nmpf.org. Under our policy priorities, we have lots of information, and we update it daily for all of these topics. I will be sending around an email tomorrow with a link to this presentation. I will also include a link to sign up for our publication. So if you want to stay in touch, you can be as little or as, we have a spectrum. You can be updated daily, monthly, whatever you want. So I'll send that link out tomorrow. So I think I had a couple closing things I wanted to say. Our next webinar is scheduled for Tuesday, August 11th. The topic will be how to be the advocate that your member of Congress needs. With that, thank you for joining us. Stay safe and be well. Thanks, guys.